Alright, in this sketch, I want to try to do my best to share my thoughts that I have while I'm sketching to hopefully give you some insights into the decisions that I'm making. So let's go ahead and jump right in. As you can see, I already have my preliminary sketch on paper, and I'll be using my fountain pen to ink everything. Well, at least for most of this. You see, this is the sketch where my fountain pen finally failed on me. I'll talk a little bit more about that in a minute, but for now, I'm going to do what I normally do, and that is to start adding the primary lines. Now, when I start with a pre-sketch, I don't exclusively draw the primary lines first, but I do like to start with some major lines that help define the shapes of my buildings, because it helps me to work inward toward adding detail. However, the benefit of starting with a pre-sketch is that most of those primary lines have already been roughed in, which allows me to explore my drawing differently than I normally would without a pencil sketch. For example, I spent a little time drawing out this canopy here because I thought it looked interesting and fun. And you'll see me do that throughout this sketch. I'll start with the primary lines, but then I'll jump around to different elements that I find fun to draw. It's just something that helps keep me interested in a drawing. Okay, I'm going to talk about my pen really quick. I was having some issues with the flow of my ink in some previous videos, and I didn't know if it was a cartridge issue or a pen issue, so I decided to clean out my pen and replace the cartridge. The problem is, I didn't let my pen dry completely, so for a while I was drawing with a mixture of water and ink. It was actually kind of a cool effect until that water wore off, which is where this video picks up. The ink is flowing pretty smoothly now, but a little later, you'll notice that the pen just gives up on me. Okay, as I continue working on the storefront, I'll go ahead and speed up the video. Back to the drawing, I want to point out that you'll notice that I predominantly draw with a grip that's right in the middle of my fountain pen. Now, why do I do that? Well, for me, it's easier to draw longer, straighter lines when you work with a loose grip like this. Something else you might notice is that I'm going to be making use of the backside of my fountain pen. One of the tricks you can do when drawing with a fountain pen is to flip it upside down and draw with the back of the nib. This is going to help you get a slightly thinner line. I sometimes like to play with line weight in my sketches. However, I will admit that I don't really explore anything too exaggerated. There are several good artists out there who do a really good job mixing up line weight in their drawings, and that's a technique that I really want to work on. Now, I'm just going to play with it a little bit today. I'm not really going to push it. Okay, as I mentioned earlier, I really like to jump around my drawings, and you're going to see a lot of that in this sketch. Another reason why you might see me jump around a lot is because I might get myself into an area that I'm not quite sure how I want to approach or how the lines are going to work out. So in these cases, I just move over to something else that's a little simpler to draw, and I'll work on that. And it's almost like I have to find a rhythm when I'm drawing before I can jump into the more complicated line work. Okay, in a minute you're going to see me draw the telephone pole here. You'll see me get a little wobbly on one of those lines, but I'll talk about that in a minute. But what I want to address right now is that I'm going to be drawing the vertical lines of my telephone pole first, and then I'll draw the bottom curved line to connect the two. This is a deliberate decision that I'm making because in a previous video, I decided to draw the base of the telephone pole first and then draw the vertical lines connecting it. It turns out it was much more difficult to start at the top of the page and draw a vertical line all the way down to connect an existing line. I actually made a mistake and strayed off a little bit. But in that video, I kind of explained how I would fix something like that. Now, when I draw telephone poles, I'll make sure that I'm drawing the vertical lines first and then connecting them together. And this brings up an interesting point. Becoming better at drawing is really more of an art in continuous learning. Not only is practice going to help you improve, but it's making those mistakes and finding ways to navigate them. Okay, let's talk about that wobbly line at the top of that telephone pole. If you've watched my other videos, you've heard me mention that it's okay that your lines aren't perfect. In fact, these flaws are what gives your sketch character. And by the end of this sketch, I'll guarantee you won't even notice that mistake. If you want to get technical, this is the Gestalt principle and theory, where the sum whole of my entire drawing will be perceived over any individual error. Okay, another thing that I want to talk about is drawing from your wrist versus drawing from your shoulder. and you'll see me do both. If you think about it, the most common way to make a line is to rotate your wrist as you're drawing. When you do that, your pen is going to follow the natural arc of your wrist, which you'll have to compensate for if you want to draw a straight line, especially if it's a long straight line. If you were to draw from the shoulder, keeping your wrist locked, then it becomes much easier to draw that long straight line. Which brings me to hand position. The angle at which you approach a line can determine how easy or difficult that line is going to be for you to draw. And you're going to see me move my hand position around a lot. In fact, as I try to draw the sidewalk lines down here, you'll see right here that I'm trying to find the correct hand placement for these lines, and it takes a couple of tries to figure it out. In my opinion, the easiest way to draw a line is when you're pulling the pen toward you. Now, that's not always practical, but that's where hand position comes into play. I want to talk about something else to help improve your drawings that you're not going to see me do, and that is to rotate your paper. That's probably one advice that I highly recommend for beginners. You should always set yourself up to draw the easiest line by rotating your paper to match that wrist position or hand angle. Now, when I'm filming for YouTube, I try to keep my paper stationary. I believe that it's easier to watch and follow along in a video format, but it also does add a level of difficulty, and it's something that I normally don't do on a normal project. And speaking of hand placement, another thing you might have noticed is that I always have to keep my right hand on the page somewhere. For me, this just helps to stabilize that paper so I'm not moving it around when I'm drawing, but it also helps me feel connected to the drawing. Coming up here, you're going to see me move those markers on the right side out of the way, and this is because I'm getting close to the right edge of my page, and I need a place to place my right hand. And after I move those markers, if you look really close on my right hand, you might notice the ink stains after trying to fix my pen. As I mentioned earlier, when I was trying to clean out my pen, I pulled off the nib and the pen exploded on me. Okay, I want to share another technique that I like to use when I'm drawing, and that is to concentrate my detail inward, toward the center of my scene. You'll notice that the storefront has a lot of detail, but as I draw these areas on the edges of my sketch, I'm going to be lighter on that detail. And I'll use lines that trail off or marks that simply imply detail, but really don't put a lot of effort into capturing that detail or capturing every line. This is just a technique to focus the eye on the important areas and establish a focal point. And you'll see that when I move over into coloring that I'm going to apply the same techniques. Okay, as I start to draw out some of the detail on the edges of my scene up here, you're going to see me work on the railing. And as I finish drawing all the lines, you'll notice that it looks kind of flat. So I'm going to do a quick little trick to give it more dimensionality, and that is I'm just going to thicken up the lines on the bottom side of the railing between each rung, and this is going to help produce that effect where those railing rungs look like they're overlapping that line. And now it looks like the railing is starting to match that perspective. Now, as I continue to draw out the detail, you'll see me use the back side of my pen again as I work my way over to the left side of the page. And I'm going to be using the same approach as I did on the right side, which is to taper off my detail as I get closer to the edges of my page. I'm also going to be making decisions on what detail I want to include and what detail I don't. For example, toward the top of the telephone pole, there is some additional metal detail that hangs off the left side that I completely skip over. The reason I decided not to draw this is that I felt it would be too distracting and too difficult to place visually. It was also out of the way, so I didn't think it'd be missed. I almost had the same thought with the pipework that I'm drawing now. Originally, I thought the pipes were unnecessary to add, but I decided that it could add a little bit of additional interest to the edges. I'll go ahead and speed up the video as I draw out the rest of this area. Now, this is about the time that my pen starts to fail, so you'll notice a rough go at times trying to put down some line work. And right here you can see that I'm no longer getting any ink. For those of you who might ask, my ink cartridge is completely full, so I knew it was something else going on with my pen, so that's when I made the decision to switch over and use a different pen, which happened to be my Pilot G2 0.5 millimeter tip. And the reason why I continued with the different pen is that I was kind of in the zone and I didn't want to stop mid-drawing. For those of you who aren't familiar with cleaning a fountain pen, it can be quite the process. Also, one more thing I want to point out, after I complete all of the coloring, I will make the decision to take another pass at my texture, and you'll see me switch over to a third type of pen, which I'll talk more about that when I get there. Now, this pen that I'm drawing with has very similar lines to my fountain pen, so I'm not too worried about it looking off. I do really enjoy drawing with the fountain pen, and I feel like the ink flows a lot smoother and it's easier to get a mark. However, I definitely feel like I have more control with this G2. It's a hard feeling to describe, but I encourage you to experiment with different types of pens and get a sense of how they feel and which ones you prefer. Alright, at this point, I have all of my major detail that I want to capture in my sketch. Well, at least I think I do, but more on that later. And now I'm going to switch over to start to take my first pass at texture. In this case, it's really just the brick wall that I'll be focusing on, and I'm going to be doing this by drawing some evenly spaced hatch lines to suggest the brick coursework. Now I decided not to go in and add lines to suggest the individual bricks at first. I do end up doing that later, but for now I was trying to experiment with a certain style for my texture. And after I finish my coloring, you will see me go back and take another pass at the brick texture. But for now, as I wrap up my line work, I'm going to move over into coloring. Now, I wanted to try something different with my colors, and that is to start with the high contrast shadows and then move over to building up my colors. So you'll see me use the Copic black marker to add the deepest shadows first. And as I start drawing out these shadows, I will notice that there's a few areas of details that I've missed that I did want to include, so I'm going to go back and add those back in. And I'll go ahead and speed up the video as I use my G2 to finish this sketch. Now, as I wrap up the high contrast shadows, I do want to point out that I didn't use my normal method, which is to apply all of my shadows first. I usually like to establish my values first by adding those shadows and then moving on to coloring. But I actually jump right into the coloring and I skip all of my midtone shadows. Now, the reason for this is I did want to kind of experiment with coloring on my sketch, and my goal was to try to use the Copic markers to build up those colors as best as I could, which also included potentially building up those shadows. Now, by the time I wrap up the coloring, I do feel like the image is a little flat, but now that just becomes a lesson that I've learned for future drawings. I feel like I get more out of my sketches when I put down all of my shadow tones first. If my goal is to capture a good contrast in a sketch, then starting with the shadows and defining all those values will definitely make that easier. By adding shadows first without color, it's easier to identify those areas of contrast between the surface and establish those values. However, what I'm learning for myself is when I have a color layer already down on my sketch, I feel like it obscures the values and makes it more difficult for me to get the right tones. Okay, I want to now talk about some of the coloring techniques that I'm using. As you can see, I've already started to layer in additional brick color by going over the existing color. One of the things that I like best about alcohol markers is the ability to layer colors and get a deeper tone with each layer. In this case, I'm using that technique to get some variation to my brick texture. Additionally, you're going to see me layer multiple different colors on top of one another. I'm only working with a set of 36 markers, so I have a limited color palette, so it's necessary for me to find ways to create new colors, which I can do by layering them. Now, the storefront is an example of me trying to push those colors by layering them. This is where I feel I still have a lot to learn with color blending. I stopped short of where my color needs to be because I was concerned that I would ruin my sketch if I kept trying to push it. Now, in a scenario like this, what I should have done is I should have tested my colors on a separate piece of paper and allowed myself to make that mistake and experiment with the color layering. That way, I could have worked out the combination of colors, but instead I just kept drawing and let this one be. Now, I want to talk about the shadows that you see on the right side of my page. Lately, I have been experimenting with using a deep purple color for my shadows. I think it adds a lot of interest and it kind of mimics the colors found in sunlight shadows. Now, if you paid attention, you might have seen me use a clear marker to color the surface first before I added those shadows. This clear marker just helped me to prime the surface with a layer of alcohol so that when I add my shadows, those colors will blend a little bit more into the page. I will also hit those shadows again with another pass of my clear marker. This again just helps to soften those shadows. I'm going to go ahead and speed up the video as I add more coloring. I want you to pay attention as I do a few things here. You'll see me layer colors to get a new color, and you'll see me bounce around from my colors to my shadows. Again, this is not my normal process, but I wanted to experiment with approaching the sketch using a different process. I do have a full video that shows my normal process where I do layer my shadows first and then add the colors on top. Okay, coming up here, you're going to see me use a warm gray marker to add some subtle texture and variation to my storefront. Everything was looking a little flat, so I decided to layer in some more colors in certain areas, trying to capture that natural variation of the texture. I definitely could have made this a little more exaggerated, but I think it helps to break up the monotony. And as I start to wrap up the coloring, I will move over and do another pass at the texture, but first I want you to notice how my colors have less detail on the edges of my scene. This, again, just really helps pull that focus into the middle of my page. And I'll go ahead and speed up this video. Okay, you're going to see me use my clear marker again, but this time I'm going to use it in a different way. Previously, I was using it over my shadows to help soften the edges, but now I'm going to be using it at the bottom of my seat on the road to push the color back into the page. You can see as I keep going over the same area, the color gets lighter and lighter. I'm really laying down this clear color to push that gray through the paper, creating a washed out effect. I'm purposely leaving out areas untouched to create the illusion of the shadows of those power lines. Okay, now that I'm done with my coloring, I'm looking at the sketch and it still feels really flat to me. So I'm going to make another pass at this, but this time I'm going to be using a fine liner to add texture. As you can see, I'm using the Copic Multiliner 0.1 millimeter. This pen is waterproof and alcohol proof, so it should hold up just fine if I decided to add more colors. I'll be using a number of techniques here to add a bit of texture to the major elements in my scene, and as I do that, I want to go back to my previous comments on switching up my process with this sketch. It was between prioritizing adding shadows first versus prioritizing adding colors. In this sketch, I prioritized adding my colors first, and I feel like it made it more difficult to add good values to my sketch. So my preference is to definitely start with your shadow layers. I would recommend to use 2 or 3 different tones for your shadows and build them up one at a time. This really does help you to manage your overall values and produce an image that pops more. When you're focusing on the values first, you really can define that contrast. I know it's just my preference, and there are other techniques out there, but I encourage you to use what works for you and what you feel comfortable with. But for me, I feel like when I start with the color, it tends to obscure my values, making it harder for me to balance that contrast in my scene. Okay, as I wrap up my textures, the one thing that I want to talk about with my textures is that if you pay attention, I'm not really putting down a lot of detail in every area. Most of the areas that have textures are unfinished. I'm not drawing every line, I'm just adding enough detail to imply the texture. I don't need to draw every brick. I don't need to be perfect capturing every little debris. A small grouping of dots or dashes can go a long way to implying texture for an entire surface. So as you explore adding textures, consider that less is more. I've experimented with the new process in this one, and even though I was uncertain of the outcome, I think I was able to save it using that extra layer of texture. If you haven't already, please give this video a like and subscribe. And that's it. That's my final sketch.